My daughter asked a stranger in the park if she was going to be her new mom. I wanted to disappear into the ground so completely that the grass would grow back over me and no one would ever find what was left. That's the honest version of how this story starts. Not with something poetic about fate or second chances or the way sunlight looks on a Tuesday afternoon in September. It starts with me standing 6 feet away, holding 2 juice boxes and a bag of pretzels, watching my 5-year-old daughter walk up to a woman she had never met and say, in the clear, carrying voice that children use when they have absolutely no awareness of what they are doing, "Are you going to be my new mom?" And the woman looked up from the book she had been reading on the park bench, and looked at Lily, and looked at me, and I cannot tell you what her expression was, because I had already stopped being able to process visual information correctly. I just stood there, with the juice boxes sweating in my hands, thinking, this is it. This is the moment I cease to exist. Her name, the woman on the bench, was Selin. I found that out about 4 minutes later, after I had crossed the 12 feet of grass between us in what felt like 100 steps, crouched down next to Lily, and said her name 3 times. In the specific tone, that means, we are going to have a conversation about this later. But right now, I need you to understand that you cannot say things like that to strangers. Lily looked at me with the expression she uses when she believes she has done something perfectly reasonable and I am overreacting, which is the expression of a person who will one day be absolutely terrifying to argue with, and said, "But Daddy, you said you were lonely." Which is when I understood that children hear everything and forget nothing, and that whatever small private grief I had allowed myself to express out loud in the last few months had been catalogued and stored and would be produced as evidence at the worst possible moment. Selin, to her enormous credit, did not laugh. She introduced herself, shook Lily's hand with complete seriousness, and said it was very nice to meet her. Then she looked at me and said, "She seems like she knows what she wants." I said, "I was so sorry." She said, "Don't be." I stood there holding the juice boxes for another moment, utterly at a loss, and then Lily grabbed one from my hand and sat down on the bench next to Selin like she had been invited, and I understood that I was not leaving this park anytime soon. My name is James. I'm 36 years old, and I have been a single father for 2.5 years since my ex-wife Maya and I agreed, with more mutual exhaustion than malice, that our marriage had finished itself quietly sometime in the previous year, without either of us noticing the exact moment it went. Lily was 3 when we separated. She is 5 now, and she lives with me 4 days a week, and with Maya 3 days, an arrangement that works because Maya and I are, in the aftermath of our marriage, significantly better at being co-parents than we ever were at being spouses, which is not something either of us could have predicted when we were in the middle of it, but which we have both come to accept as one of life's stranger gifts. I work as a high school history teacher, which means I am structurally good at explaining things to young people and structurally terrible at the kind of administrative chaos that comes with single parenthood. The permission slips and the pediatric dentist appointments and the 4-day notice costume requirements that schools produce, with what I can only describe as gleeful indifference to working parents' schedules. I was not, before the park, looking for anyone. That is important to say clearly, because it would be easy to tell this story as the story of a lonely man who was finally ready for love. And while the lonely part is accurate, the ready part is more complicated. I had told myself I was content. I had built a routine, Lily and I, that worked in the efficient, slightly improvised way of a household run by one tired adult and one extremely opinionated small person. Saturday mornings were for the park. Not every Saturday, not with any particular emotional intention, just because Lily liked the swings and there was a good coffee cart nearby, and I could sit on a bench and read something while she ran herself tired, which was the closest thing I had to genuine peace in a given week. I had been doing this for almost 2 years. I had become, in my own small way, a regular. The coffee cart man knew my order. The woman who ran the weekend yoga class in the adjacent field sometimes nodded at me. I knew which benches got afternoon shade. I was not waiting for anything. I was just there. Selin was not a regular. I had not seen her before that Saturday, which I noticed in the vague way you notice new people in spaces you have claimed through repetition. She was sitting on the bench I usually sat on, which is how Lily had gotten close enough to speak to her in the first place, because Lily had walked over to investigate the situation on my behalf, a role she performs frequently and without being asked. Selin was reading something with a plain cover, her legs crossed at the ankle, a paper coffee cup on the bench beside her. Dark hair, mid-length, pulled back loosely. She was wearing the kind of practical clothes that suggest a person came from somewhere and is going somewhere else, and is not particularly interested in being noticed in between. She looked, from across the park, like someone who was very good at being alone in a public place, which is its own kind of skill and one I recognized because I had been practicing it myself for 2 years. I had not intended to speak to her. I had intended to retrieve my usual bench, sit down, open my book, and drink my coffee in the 10 to 15 minutes before Lily decided she needed something. Then Lily solved the problem of the occupied bench in her own direct fashion. What happened in the following hour is something I have tried to describe to several people since, and have never quite managed to convey accurately, because the surface of it sounds ordinary, and the truth of it was that nothing about it felt ordinary at all. We sat on the bench, the three of us, with Lily between us, in the way that children position themselves when they have decided something, and we talked. Lily talked mostly, at first, with the confidence of someone who has never experienced a conversation she wasn't welcome in, telling Selin about her preschool, about her best friend, whose name was Poppy, about a caterpillar she had found the previous week and named Gerald, before her father had gently explained that Gerald had become a butterfly and would not be coming back. Selin listened to all of this with a quality of attention I had almost forgotten people could give to children, not the slightly performed patience of an adult waiting for their turn to speak, but genuine interest, asking follow-up questions about Gerald with a seriousness that Lily recognized immediately and rewarded with the full force of her personality. At some point, Lily announced that she needed the swings and departed at speed, leaving Selin and me on the bench together in a silence that had a slightly different quality to it than before. I said something about how I hoped Lily hadn't bothered her. Selin said she wasn't bothered. I said I didn't know where the question had come from. Celine said she thought children usually know exactly where their questions come from. They just haven't learned yet to decide not to ask them. I looked at her. She was watching Lily on the swings with a small, private expression I couldn't quite read. I asked if she had any of her own, kids. She said no. She said she had wanted them at some point with someone specific, and that it hadn't happened, and that she was, at 33, in the ongoing process of figuring out what she felt about that, which she offered with the directness of someone who has made peace with saying true things to strangers because she has found it less exhausting than the alternative. I told her that was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in a park in years. She looked at me and said, "Your daughter asked me if I was going to be her new mom." That set a fairly high bar for honesty. I laughed, which was the first time I had laughed at something unexpected in longer than I could accurately recall. She was a landscape architect, not a regular at this park, as I had assumed, but here for a site assessment on an adjacent property being considered for a residential development, which she was professionally opposed to and personally furious about, but contractually obligated to evaluate objectively. She had come early and walked through the park first, the way she said she always did, with sites adjacent to green space, to understand what would be lost before she was required to measure what might be gained. She said this with a matter-of-fact quality that made it sound like professional methodology, but that I understood, listening to it, was actually something closer to grief management, a way of honoring a thing before being asked to do something difficult in relation to it. I recognized that approach because I had used various versions of it myself. She asked what I did. I said I taught history to 16-year-olds. She said that sounded either very rewarding or very exhausting. I said it was both simultaneously, every day, without interruption. She nodded like that made complete sense to her. Lily came back for pretzels, ate them with focused efficiency, announced that a boy on the slide had told her she couldn't climb it the fast way, and that she had climbed it the fast way anyway, and then returned to the slide to apparently consolidate her position. Selin watched her go and said, quietly, more to herself than to me, "She's magnificent." Something about the word she chose, not cute, not sweet, not any of the words adults usually use to diminish children into smaller categories, but magnificent, Something about that word and the way she said it made me understand that this was a person who paid attention to the right things. I said she was. I said she was also exhausting and occasionally terrifying, and that every day with her felt like being trusted with something I wasn't entirely sure I deserved. Selin looked at me sideways and said, "Most parents feel that way." I said, "I knew." I said the difference was that I felt it out loud more than I should, and apparently I had said as much in Lily's presence at some point without realizing it, hence the question. Celine said, "She heard that you were lonely and she tried to fix it. That's not something to be embarrassed about. That's love." I didn't have anything to say to that. I looked at my coffee, which had gone cold. Before she left, she asked me the name of the coffee cart because she'd had a bad cup from somewhere else and mine smelled better. I told her. She said, "Thank you for the company." I said we were the ones who had imposed on her. She said she had stayed by choice. Lily, who had appeared at my elbow sometime in the previous 2 minutes, without either of us noticing, looked up at Celine and said, "Will you be here next Saturday?" Celine looked at me. I looked at Lily. Lily looked at Celine with the serene, expectant expression of someone who has asked a reasonable question and is simply waiting for the answer. Celine said she didn't know, that she had a lot of work to do on the site report, and it depended on how that went. Lily considered this and said, "We'll be here, just so you know." And then she walked off toward the swings again, her contribution to the situation complete. Celine and I stood there in the mildly stunned silence of two adults who have just been managed by a 5-year-old, and I said, "I apologize again." And she said, "Stop apologizing," and smiled and walked away toward the gate with her book under her arm, and I stood in the park like an idiot watching her go until Lily shouted for me to push her. I told myself all week that it was nothing, that I wouldn't see her again, and that it didn't matter either way. I had a full life, a busy routine, a daughter who needed me present and focused, a stack of ungraded essays on the Franco-Prussian War that had been sitting on my kitchen table since Wednesday. I was not the kind of person who stood in parks hoping someone would come back. I had not thought about her more than occasionally, maybe more than occasionally. The point is that when Saturday came and Lily announced at 8:30 in the morning that she needed to go to the park because she had things to do there, I did not question it, and when we arrived and the bench was empty, I felt something in my chest that I recognized and immediately dismissed. We had coffee, Lily had the swings. I read 2 pages of the same chapter 4 times without retaining anything. At 11:45, Lily announced from the climbing frame that the lady was here. I looked up. Celine was walking through the gate with her work bag over one shoulder, a folder under her arm, and the same paper coffee cup from the same cart, which meant she had taken my recommendation, which meant she had remembered it, which I noted and set aside. She had not come for us. She was genuinely working, sitting at a different bench with her folder open and measuring tools spread out, doing something with a surveyor's printout that involved a lot of focused attention and occasional notation. Lily, however, had a very different understanding of the situation. She walked over with the purposeful energy of someone completing a transaction and said, "You came." Celine looked up and smiled, a real one, and said she had, and they proceeded to have a conversation about Gerald the butterfly that apparently picked up exactly where it had left off the previous week. I came over eventually, because Lily called for me in the tone, "That means your presence has been requested and is expected," and the 3 of us sat on the bench again in the October afternoon and talked while Celine worked intermittently, and it felt, in the way of things that are becoming something before you have given them permission to, entirely natural. Like we had been doing this for longer than 2 weeks. Like the absence of it, before 2 weeks ago, was a gap I simply hadn't noticed. The 3rd Saturday, it rained, and I decided not to go to the park because I was a rational adult capable of making reasonable decisions, and Lily cried for 12 minutes. Then I put on her raincoat and my raincoat, and we went to the park, and Celine was already there under the tree that offered the most shelter, still with the folder, still with the coffee, slightly damp around the edges, but apparently unbothered. Lily took one look at her and said, "I knew you'd be here." Celine looked at me over Lily's head with an expression that was somewhere between amused and something else I couldn't name at a distance of 6 feet in the rain. I said, "She cried for 12 minutes. Celine said, "Only 12? I said, "I thought that was impressive." She said she agreed. Lily was already organizing us into positions under the tree, with the decisiveness of a very small general, and we spent 40 minutes under a tree in the rain in October, talking about landscape architecture and the Franco-Prussian War, and what Lily wanted to be when she grew up, which changed twice during the conversation. When it was time to go, Lily held Selen's hand on the way to the gate like it was something she had done 100 times, and I watched it happen and felt something I would not let myself name yet, because naming it felt like tempting, something I did not know how to deserve. I asked for her number on the 4th Saturday. I had been composing the question for 3 weeks, running through versions of it, none of which felt right, because every version of it carried the weight of everything that asking meant, which was not simply asking for a way to contact someone, but asking if what had been building in a public park on weekend mornings over the course of a month was real and mutual and worth the risk of acknowledging directly. I am, under ordinary circumstances, not a cowardly person. I have said difficult things in difficult rooms. I have had conversations with 16-year-olds about the Franco-Prussian War that required more courage than most people give those conversations credit for. But standing in front of Selen while Lily negotiated with the pretzel bag and the afternoon light came through the trees at the angle that had started to feel like specifically this hour with specifically this person, I understood that I was frightened in a way I had not been frightened in years, because the last time I had wanted something like this, I had also gotten it and then watched it end, and I had promised myself at various points in the 2 years since that the not wanting was easier and cleaner and did not produce the specific variety of pain that wanting produced when it went wrong. Selen solved the problem for me, which I have come to understand is something she does, not because she is impatient with hesitation, but because she reads situations with the accuracy of someone who has spent a professional life understanding spaces and what they need. She took a pen from her bag and wrote her number on the back of a site survey printout and handed it to me and said, "For scheduling purposes." I said, "Scheduling purposes." She said, "Saturdays are becoming complicated." I looked at her for a moment and then I put the paper in my pocket and said, "I'll text you." She said, "I know." We had dinner the following Thursday without Lily, which required coordination with Maya that I performed with probably unnecessary thoroughness given that I was asking for 2 extra hours on a Thursday, and Maya, to her credit and my mild embarrassment, said nothing beyond, of course, and have a good time in the carefully neutral tone of someone who has chosen to be a good co-parent instead of a complicated ex-spouse. Celine met me at a restaurant she had chosen, on the basis that she knew the area better than I did, a small place with good food and lighting that was warm without being romantic in a pressured way. I was 7 minutes late because I had changed my shirt twice and could not find parking. She was already there and had already ordered water, and was reading something on her phone in the particular way that suggests a person is genuinely occupied, rather than performing being occupied. She looked up when I came in, and the expression on her face when she saw me was the expression I had been turning over in my mind since the first Saturday in the park, the one I had not been able to name at a distance of 6 feet in the rain, and I understood it now from across a restaurant. It was the expression of someone who was also frightened and had also decided to come anyway. We talked for 3 hours. I know this because I checked my watch when we sat down, and I checked it again when the restaurant was gently suggesting they needed the table, and the distance between those 2 moments was 3 hours that had felt like considerably less. She told me about the site report, which she had filed with a recommendation against development that she knew her firm would overrule, but which she had written as carefully and completely as she knew how, because she believed in doing the work correctly, even when the outcome was already decided. She told me about her family, her parents who had come from Turkey 30 years ago and still ran the bakery they had opened in their first year in this country, and could not understand why she had become a landscape architect instead of something with a clearer income trajectory. She told me she had been engaged once, several years ago, to a man she had loved and had not been able to reach the parts of that she was still working out. She said it with the same directness she had shown in the park, and I recognized it as her way of handing me the information so that I could decide what to do with it rather than waiting for it to come out sideways later. I told her about Maya, about the end of the marriage, about the specific grief of something concluding not dramatically but quietly, with mutual acknowledgement that it was over, which in some ways was harder than a dramatic ending because it gave you nothing to be angry at. She listened to all of this with her full attention, which I had come to understand was the thing about her, that she listened the way she looked at sights, completely, taking in what was actually there rather than what she expected to find. When we finally left, she said she'd had a good evening. I said I had too. We stood outside on the pavement with the particular uncertainty of an ending that isn't quite sure where it's going, and she said, "So, Saturday?" I said, "Saturday." She said, "I'll be at the bench." I said, "We'll find you." She smiled and walked toward the train station, and I stood there in the cold for a moment thinking about how I had spent 2 years being not ready, and how, standing on a pavement outside a restaurant on a Thursday night, I didn't feel not ready anymore. The Saturdays continued. The arrangement evolved without either of us formally discussing it, because some things don't need to be formally discussed, they just gradually become true. Selin's site report was filed. Her professional obligation to the park adjacent was complete, but she came on Saturdays anyway because Lily expected her, and because, she said, she had gotten attached to the coffee cart. Lily, for her part, treated the whole development with the serene confidence of someone who had identified a situation and corrected it. She was not demonstrative about it. She did not announce her satisfaction, or reference the original question, or behave as though anything unusual had happened. She simply incorporated Celine into the Saturday routine with the completeness of a person who has always trusted her own judgment and has just been proved right again. There was an afternoon in November, the one I think of when I think of the moment I stopped being frightened, when Lily fell asleep in the car on the way home from the park, and I carried her inside, and Celine helped me get her boots off without waking her, which is an operation requiring 2 people and a level of coordination that is either maddening or intimate, depending on who you're doing it with. We stood in Lily's room in the quiet after, both of us looking at her the way you look at something that matters, and Celine said, very softly, "I understand what you meant. About feeling like you don't deserve it." I looked at her. She was still looking at Lily. She said, "I feel that way too, sometimes. Like there's a version of this, I don't know how to trust yet." I said, "Then we'll both be careful." She looked at me. I said, "Careful doesn't have to mean slow." She said, "I know." And then we went into the kitchen and I made dinner, and she set the table, and Lily slept through both. And when she woke up and found Celine still there, she looked at me with the expression that meant I had finally done something right. That was 8 months ago. Lily is 6 now, and she has stopped asking Celine if she is going to be her new mom because the question has been answered, not formally, not with any announcement, but in the accumulated truth of every Saturday and every Thursday dinner and every set of boots carefully removed in a quiet bedroom. She calls her Celine, not mom, because Maya is her mom, and Lily is a precise person who understands the distinction, but she reaches for her hand in the park the way she did on that 3rd Saturday in the rain, without asking, without ceremony, as if it is simply the correct thing to do, which, for a 5-year-old who asked a stranger on a park bench the most honest question in the world and turned out to be completely right, I suppose it was. I asked Celine to marry me in March, in the park, on the bench, because some places have become too particular to abandon for more photogenic alternatives, and because Lily was there, which felt correct, because she had started this and she deserved to be in the room for what it had become. Celine said yes before I had finished the sentence, in the way she does things, directly and without waiting for the last moment to resolve, and Lily screamed with a volume that sent 3 pigeons off a nearby railing, and then declared that she had known this was going to happen all along, which is either prescience or revisionism, but either way, I chose to accept it as the former. We are getting married in September. In the park, because Celine will not hear of anywhere else, because she says she has an obligation to green space and the park deserves the credit. I told her that was professional ethics applied to personal life. She said all her ethics were personal. I said I knew that already. She said, "Your daughter figured it out in 30 seconds. I said, "My daughter is usually faster than me." She said, "I noticed." And she laughed. And I thought about the first time I had heard her laugh, and about the 12 feet of grass between the gate and the bench, and about the juice boxes I had been holding, and about the specific horror and the specific grace of being asked the right question at exactly the right moment by the smallest, most confident person I have ever known. Lily is currently deciding what she wants to wear to the wedding. She has narrowed it to 3 options and changes her mind every few days, which is, her mother tells me, entirely on schedule for a 6-year-old making a major sartorial decision. She has also informed me that she is planning a speech. I asked what the speech would cover. She said she was going to tell everyone how she fixed it. I said that was accurate. She said she knew. I looked at her in the specific way. I look at her when she does something that is both outrageous and completely correct. The look that means I have no argument because she is right. And she looked back at me with the serene confidence of a person who has never once doubted her own judgment. And honestly, given the evidence, I think she has earned it. There are things I did not expect about this, about loving someone after a marriage that ended quietly, about building something new in the middle of an ongoing life that had already established its own rhythms and its own particular grief. I did not expect it to feel so different from what came before, not better or worse, but genuinely distinct. The way 2 versions of the same place can look completely different, depending on the light and the season and who you are standing next to when you look. I loved Maya, and I was not able to build what either of us needed inside that love, and the failure of it left me with a very specific idea of what I was capable of and what I was not. Selin arrived, or rather, Lily delivered her, with no interest in that idea. She was not interested in my careful accounting of what I could and couldn't do. She was interested, in the same way she was interested in a site before she was required to measure it, in what was actually there. What is actually there? I have come to understand over 8 months of Saturdays and Thursdays and occasional Wednesdays, and one rainy Sunday when the Children's Museum had a queue so long, we abandoned it and went to a gallery instead, and Lily fell asleep. Against Selin's arm in front of an abstract painting, and neither of us moved for 40 minutes because we didn't want to disturb her. What is actually there is something that does not require careful management, or the suspension of reasonable skepticism, or any of the mental arrangements I had made in 2.5 years of single parenthood to convince myself I was content. It simply is what it is, a thing I walked into sideways on a Saturday morning while I was thinking about something else, delivered by my 5-year-old with the directness and confidence of someone who understood the situation better than either of the adults in it. I have told Lily more than once that what she did that day in the park was not appropriate behavior, that you do not walk up to strangers and ask them to join your family. She listens to this with the polite attention she gives to things she disagrees with, and is too kind to argue about directly. She doesn't fight me on it. She just looks at me, patient and certain, in the way she has looked at me since she was old enough to look at anything, and she lets me say what I need to say. Then she usually asks for a snack, or returns to whatever she was doing, and the moment passes, and we move on. I have come to accept that I will not win this particular argument. I have come to accept that she was right, and I was wrong, and that sometimes the 5-year-old sees the situation more clearly than the adult who has spent 2 years carefully not seeing it. Selin and I talked once, late on a Thursday when Lily was asleep, and we were sitting with tea at the kitchen table after the kind of ordinary evening that had somehow become the part of my week I looked forward to most, about that first Saturday, about what it had been like for her to have Lily walk up to her on the bench and ask that question without warning. I had imagined, during the week after it happened, that it must have been mortifying, intrusive, the kind of thing that would make a person gather their things and leave. Celine said it had been the opposite. She said she had been sitting on that bench in the middle of a workday she was already dreading, thinking about the site report and the development she knew was going to be approved despite everything she wrote, and she had been in that particular low mood that she called the weight of doing correct work for incomplete reasons. And then a small girl had walked up to her with complete confidence and asked her the most direct question anyone had asked her in years, and she had looked across the grass at the man holding the juice boxes, and she had felt, she said, very clearly, and she offered this with the directness that I have come to love about her, something shift, not toward me specifically yet, she said, more like toward the possibility of things, which she had been keeping at a certain careful distance, for reasons she understood and was no longer entirely sure were serving her. Lily's question had walked straight past all of those reasons. She said she had stayed on that bench because she wanted to see what happened next. I asked her when she had decided she wanted to come back the following Saturday. She said immediately. I said, but the site report. She said the site report was a reason that existed because she needed one, And then she looked at me across the kitchen table in the warm lamplight with the directness she uses when she is about to say something precise. And she said, "I think I came back because your daughter asked me a question and I wanted to find out what the answer was." I looked at her. I said, "And?" She said, "The answer is yes." We sat there for a moment with that hanging between us, simply and completely, and I thought about Lily asleep in the next room, about the particular grace of a child who knows what she needs and simply asks for it, and about how long I had spent trying to want less so that the wanting would be manageable, and about how none of that preparation had made any difference in the end, because the wanting had arrived anyway, directly and without warning, as it turns out most important things do, not through any door you have carefully left open, but through the one you didn't know you'd forgotten to close. On the way to the park last Saturday, Lily told me she had written 2 lines of her wedding speech. She wouldn't tell me what they were. She said it was a surprise. I said I was sure it was going to be very good. She said she knew. She was quiet for a moment, watching the streets go by, and then she said, "Daddy, I did good, right?" I looked at her in the rearview mirror, this person I had been entrusted with, who was in every important way smarter and more direct and more honest than I was. And I said, "Lily, you did so good." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to looking out the window. I drove the rest of the way to the park, in the particular silence of someone who has been given exactly what they needed and is still adjusting to the weight of it, the good weight, the kind you don't put down,